Hello, welcome to this final session of Gravitee Edge 2023. We've had an awesome time having you with us. I hope you have as well. You'll see here next to me, we've got the two amigos, David and Linus, here to talk. They'll provide all the important insights and stuff for this last session. I'll just be the good looks. And I hope we have a great last session. Just to wrap up things, just to say thank you to everyone for joining. And just to summarise a few bits really that we experienced over the last few days. And as I said, thanks so much for engaging. You will have 30 days, if I remember correctly, to be able to watch this back again afterwards. So if you want to be able to watch it, do feel free to get in touch. Like, we always love hearing from you, anything on social media, etc. Please do that. But for this session, what we're going to specifically do is just, as I said a moment ago, just summarise really. Just have a bit of a chat with the guys here and just talk about, we'll start off talking probably a little bit about what we all thought was super interesting over the last 3 days. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we think will happen over the course of the next year, the future, and probably just summarize some of the key announcements and things like that. So without further ado, let's crack on and get into it. So guys, I don't know who wants to take it first, whether it's you.
Please.
I can do it. I can do it.
Well, I haven't asked you the question.
Oh, sorry. doesn't matter.
So what would be useful is just to say, look, what do you, if looking back over the last few days and watching all the sessions and stuff like that, what do you think was the, I don't know, 2, 3 few most interesting things from your perspective that you really took?
Yeah. So I think for me there's been two very common themes that I've seen. And I'll talk to both of them. One is kind of governance. So we've had obviously David Muter from Forrester doing one of the keynotes for us and talking about the convergence of API management and event management basically, and that kind of need of governance. And if you look at actually what David talked about was the number one inquiry that the analysts get at Forrester about event-driven architecture is actually about the governance piece. And how do you have the same type of traffic shaping and policies and that sort of stuff that you're comfortable with in the API management space? How does that apply to, it was very interesting to see that that's kind of the number one thing. It was like 33% of the inquiries about event-driven architecture from customers of Forrester that is actually looking at that sort of stuff. So governance is interesting. I think L'Oreal obviously also talking about API governance. I think in the industry, L'Oreal is seen as one of those kind of leaders when it comes to API governance and how they kind of go about that with this kind of API design first mindset. So I think a lot of the sessions touched upon these governance, and especially now with more APIs, more velocities, more technologies, like governance is key for organizations to kind of be able to survive in that sort of scale. And for me, the second thing I think is really that convergence. And we've had multiple people talking about this. One is PostNL, for example, that the angle is very much, we have needs today from our customers that we need to solve that are more synchronous, traditional. We have customers that need to know where their parcels are, and they may want to do one request per day. But they have this new emergence of new customer interactions and new customer needs that may make them look at event-driven architecture. And that's obviously something that we've seen in quite a few places.
That is super interesting though, that bit, because I think one of the most interesting things on my side is this concept that, the world is becoming more real-time maybe. It is becoming more event-driven or whatever it is, but the challenge is, I guess, coming back to my own presentation, actually, that was one of the best highlights from the sessions. But my own one was talking about how the traditional sort of, your more traditional request response sort of architectures sit alongside actually your event-driven architectures, and how it's not necessarily one or the other, but how you can actually create an environment where they all sit harmoniously. And so to your point, actually, talking about things like the governance, let's say, for example, from L'Oreal, or what always amazed me actually about with Ever and PostNL was how customer focused they are actually, and how much this touches end customers with, and how all of this complex sort of stuff that sits behind the gateway, API management more generally, how that sort of stuff is actually fundamentally important.
And at the end of the day, we can talk about all these technologies and event-driven architecture and mediation, whatever you want to call it. At the end of the day, a lot of this is about that end customer experience effectively. Whether your end customer is another business that need access to your data, whether that is, and obviously BankFab, so the first Abu Dhabi bank, spoke at this conference as well about how they provide a very seamless and secure experience to their end users that authenticate to the actual bank using a mobile or web application, and how they're using things like SIBA. And that is obviously from a security perspective, but again, it's also very much about that kind of experience for the end customer. And whether that is about real-time data, secure experiences, or just more easy access to data, I think that's what we've seen in this conference also as a kind of very much of a red thread across the sessions.
What about you, mate?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, that's also about starting to hear from customers who are adopting even native stuff. So we are seeing, and we are starting to see people really adopting event-driven architecture, pushing more and more stuff and data from the different kind of backends. And so we know that now, for me, the event native stuff was kind of a core capability from a Gravitee perspective, and we have multiple ways of extended such core capabilities with, the federation, the security, as you say, Linus, etc. And for me, that's really great to hear from these guys, so we can properly learn from what's the real use cases around the native, event native approach, and so on. So for me, if I have to remember about 2 or let's say 3 things, as you said, Rory, that would be even native, how we can extend it to provide some sort of governances and federation stuff. And the latest point will be all about the AI, because for me, that's something which is starting to be more and more democratized. We have heard from Guy from Tide, who give a great talk about the AI, what's the LLM, and all of the stuff like that. And so, that would be the main 3 things from my perspective.
That was super interesting, actually. Guy talking about all that sort of stuff and just how much change I think there'll be over the course. Not even, it's very difficult. I don't know about you guys to try and assess the velocity of change. For me, it feels like there is so much velocity at this particular point in time. But it's difficult to quantify over what period of time we expect things to really meaningfully change and all that sort of stuff. Because, API management and the world of middleware and all this sort of stuff, has always historically been quite a complex environment, I guess. And the amount of opportunity, I think, particularly when in the way that we're working with this sort of, let's call it event native API management, right? So the ability to work in one platform with both asynchronous and synchronous communication and stuff like that. That ability to be able to say, okay, well, we've got an event. I think I spoke about the concept of the flight planning data and all this sort of stuff. Like, that's interesting about, to your point, David, about the impact of machine learning, generative AI, and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah,
and I think if we just kind of build upon Guy's talk and AI as a concept, I think, and that kind of end user experience, I believe that, today we're very much talking about, different velocities of data, synchronous, asynchronous. We've talked about, L'Oreal talking about, API specifications and all these technologies and standards. I think one of the things that I believe in a couple of years' time, from a user perspective, and when I say user, I mean both an API consumer and a provider, that is probably going to be very abstracted. That as a consumer, you probably shouldn't really have to care about all this sort of stuff. Whether this is open API, async API, whether it's based on an event broker, like all this sort of stuff. I think the abstraction level that we've seen in the last couple of years, and obviously stuff that we're doing with Event Native, I think is just going to go forward and upwards with AI. And also on the provider side, that when you create and expose these API products, that it's going to be so much faster to generate the products that your end customers really want. We've seen logistics company at Gravitee Edge like PostNL and Swiss Post, for example, that are obviously creating these API products for their customers to be able to get value from kind of their parcel and distribution services. And I think generating that value for that end customer by using AI to give the products that they really, really need in a fast way to free up time, I think is also something that will be very revolutionary in the end.
Why don't we dig into that a little bit more? Because I think, one of the things I said at the beginning that maybe we would do is look ahead for a year or so, doesn't really matter. We can say a year, 2 years, whatever. And we've obviously started to touch on machine learning, AI, and stuff. I know in your talk, David, you spoke a lot about this. And what's interesting is so you've just spoken about like PostNL, Swiss Post, etc., and about data product. Started introducing the concept of data products and stuff like that. What would be interesting to hear from you guys is how do you actually see that evolving in the next year? That sort of topic, and where do you actually think that it will? But again, it doesn't have to be a year. It can be whatever time.
A quarter. I like to work in quarters, really.
Yeah. Day, minutes.
Yeah. So I think if I start, David, just on how I see this from kind of a multi-velocity and kind of that governance aspect. Maybe David, if you can maybe touch upon the AI bits and where we think Gravitee can really help in the foreseeable future.
Doesn't necessarily have to be Gravitee related, by the way.
Okay.
No.
I mean, maybe we can make it all about us. But
It's Gravitee Edge, the conference. No, I mean, okay. So if I take off my Gravitee hat, I do believe that organizations are facing themselves in a couple of, I'd say, 1 year or so. They're going to be in a situation where they have these amazing technologies, whether it's AI or not, and they have rolled it out in production. Again, whether helped with the concept of AI or not, I think it's going to be a higher velocity of products and services being created. And again, coming back to kind of my first kind of trend here at Gravitee Edge is that governance piece.
Yeah.
I think API security.
how do you do all that with the governance?
Yeah, and API security we've obviously seen over the last, I'd say, 2 years or so, really popping up as number one attack vector for a lot of enterprises. And I think we see this mindset of what is typically called API shift left, which means that it becomes more of a API provider and API product manager maybe and developer responsibility to ensure that you're getting the security right on the on the offset to really help that API governance. And I think that's something that we're going to see more and more about in the industry, maybe generally middleware, but also specifically API management, this kind of ability for organizations to really be on top of security issues before they're there effectively. And I think governance is playing a key part there, setting guidelines, rules for your organizations, best practices, and enforcing them automatically. And again, something like API management, where you have these concepts of open APIs and schemas and knowing what data runs through your systems, I think it's going to be a prime focal point for delivering those sort of measures to counter that.
Interesting.
I mean, sorry, from my perspective, I still think that we need to be a bit careful because, I mean, there is a lot of different things we are talking about: governances, federation, AI, even native, etc., etc. And for me,
how much more do you want to add to the roadmap?
I mean, I can add a lot more, but then.
And I think Linus just said in a quarter.
In a
Q4.
That's the time frame we're talking about.
Q4 ends in December, David. So roll up your sleeves.
You got what, 2 months?
Anyway, and so for me, that's more about finding the right balance, because obviously we are hearing more and more about AI stuff, and so we know that there are many different places where we can push for AI. You talked about generating very quickly an API. I gave a talk about applying the AI stuff to the developer experience through the Gravitee or the AI portal, etc. But then, for me, we still need to find the right balance for the next months, maybe for the next year, because the API management market is an interesting market, but I think we reach a point where we need to extend it. We talked about the middleware.
What do you mean when you say extend it? In what way?
Extended it just because that's not even just about APIs. With even native, we are talking about events, data brokers. What about the other things such as Salesforce and so on? So how do we create that sort of federation? How do we make sure that we are properly governing all those things around and as part of the same platform? And for me, that would be the kind of next big focus from my perspective, and all we can just reused all the capabilities offered by an API management platform and how we can extend them to apply them to other kind of heterogeneous backends and services providers or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
And I think this is where really API management is quite unique, right? Because API management is, first of all, one of few segments in technology that really focuses on data from a consumer perspective. And it has a very rich history of having very strong and robust authentication. We're talking about OpenID and OAuth2 and very kind of standardized and understandable and agreeable patterns of accessing data and exposing data. We talk about JSON schemas, average schemas, protobuf schemas, OpenAPI, async API. It's a very robust kind of segment of technology to kind of help, as you mentioned, David, like in the future when you talk about AI and making data available, you're talking about databases, Salesforces, Workdays. I think API management, the concept of that API management brings with data exposure, security, analytics, productization, standardization for schemas and so forth, is like the ingredients that you need if you're going to be able to actually make that a reality that is feasible and able to govern.
Agree.
Cool. Well, very interesting.
What's your point of view?
Well, on life or generally?
What's coming in the next year?
What's coming in the next year? I do actually, I think similar to you guys, unsurprisingly, that what do I really believe is going to happen in the next year? It's a very interesting question actually, because I think the concept of a product, I think, may re-emerge in my view, because I think as we start to go further towards this sync and async type of world, I think it becomes very interesting to actually start thinking, okay, so you now need to work in this multi-velocity way. And what does the end data consumer, I think to your point, what's super interesting from my perspective is that API management is probably the only middleware sector that I can really think of that touches that end data consumer. And that's a massive uniqueness, I would say, about the API management sector. And it has it gives you such a different perspective, I would say, rather than just thinking about the plumbing associated with everything. And that's why I say, I think one of the things that I don't think it's ever really gone away, because I think the first generation, you know, if you look back to the early 2000s, for example, what the first generation did, which I thought was interesting, is there was a hype, I would say, probably around the 2010 sort of time, 2010, 2015, that was focused on monetization, essentially, of APIs. And you got this sort of concept coming about, which was, hey, you need to be able to do, you know, a cent, a dollar, whatever it is, a euro foot per API call, per this, per that. And actually what we're starting to see is, I think there's a natural maturity curve that's happening. And what will be interesting is how things like events start to come into that, because as I think I mentioned in mine, if I remember correctly, the concept of a life cycle of an event isn't really very well defined at the moment. And I think that's the foundation that you need to have to be able to create a product. Before you can really create products on top of the data, you need to be able to create the life cycle. And then I think that, so my view is that I think the concept of products, of data, of not just APIs, but stuff like that, I think will re-emerge more. I think that also the way generative AI and machine learning and stuff, this starts to impact, I would say, that whether it's governance or whether it's productization, whatever it is, there's something there that is going to evolve at a greater pace. And that is my personal view. I think it will be interesting, actually, when I ask myself the question, let's say we roll the clock forwards, and we're all three of us sitting here looking a year older, which is going to be quite worrying. Given how old we already look in this particular
You're probably going to need a higher share.
Get me a few books and I'll sit on a few books. But the key point is, it is actually a genuinely interesting thing to ask yourself, what are we actually going to be talking about in a year's time? And I do think that there's so much that we've spoken about, that we've announced, that we've heard from people and all this sort of stuff, even over these last 3 days, that frankly will last us probably, like, there's amongst the three of us, there's no shortage of ideas that I'm sure the organisation loves to hear from us all the time. But I do think that my gut says probably more on productization, machine learning,
Yeah.
stuff like that, and productization through the lens of this sync and async journey still, certainly from our perspective.
And we've seen from customers that now they're ready to talk about even native, etc. Do you feel the same? Do you think that they could be ready to hear about, AI, ML, generative AI, and so we can bring new capabilities based on these AI technologies as part of the API management?
See, I think that's such that is a genuinely interesting question, that one, because I would say that the concept of unifying events and APIs is still pretty young in its journey of its evolutionary journey, let's say. But what we are starting to see is, as we lean into this topic, we're starting to see more of it, and it starts to open up these bigger topics like what you spoke about in your presentation in terms of this concept of not just multi-gateway, that's a bit sort of last generation in my view, but about multi-gateway and multi-broker. And then suddenly, as soon as you start it's a bit like a Pandora's box in a way, that you start opening, you're like, oh, we've got this thing over here, and it's like, well, then you start to ask the questions like, well, okay, you've now got all these brokers and all these different technologies. How do you govern that consistently? How do you make sure you've got consistent security? All these different sorts of things. So I think as we start to lean more into it, I do think it is a bit of a Pandora's box. And I think it's almost like an awakening for people, that they're starting to realize, actually, oh, hang on a sec, this is a much bigger subject than I think we had realized. And I don't know, what are your views on it?
Yeah, I think from your question, David, I think that for me, it's very much about developer productivity in terms of AI. Now, I think any product leader in any middleware space over the last 9 or 10 months or so have been like, okay, generative AI, LLM, what does it mean for my product, right? How can I ride on this hype wave and try to kind of make some benefits as an organization on top of it? I think where it at the moment is very interesting is around that developer productivity. Now, the really important thing here again is generalized LLMs and AI models, I think, will struggle to help with that API productivity. But again, as I mentioned earlier, API management is unique in a sense that it's very standard-based and schema-based. So if you look at something like Gravitee, any API you create, any data structure that runs through Gravitee is typically a JSON object or has a JSON schema or Avro protobuf. It's an open API, it's an async API. You have these standardized and agreed upon rules and definitions that obviously something like a machine learning model very well kind of benefits from, right? And I think the ability for Gravitee to help both an API provider, producer, to generate the right products based on the data that is available in their organization, and an API consumer to be able to discover and maybe even create, as you're obviously talking to in your presentation, David, I think is something that is there needs to be someone needs to lead that and show the art of the possible, and that it's guardrailed, because I think that's anyone that has played around with AI tools and LLMs would know the concept of hallucination, for example, and the risk of providing a very bad user experience and sometimes even inaccurate or false information. And I think that's where, again, it's very important to just not kind of jump as the first AI opportunity that comes. I think we have a responsibility there as an middleware organization to not do that and be respectful of the impacts that stuff like that can be. But I think to answer your question, David, I think that the API providers, the people that generate data, the people that build API products, for them to have tools that allow them to create those products faster using AI, I think is more in our near future.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I believe personally that in the future, an API consumer is going to use prompts, is going to use natural language, is going to use a more abstracted intention of wanting something, whether that exists, whether that something they want exists or not, they're going to get it. And I think AI is going to help them with that eventually. But I think that's not where we are in the next couple of months necessarily. And I think it's going to take a while for the entire industry.
Maybe 3 months.
Maybe 3 or 4 months or so. Maybe there's an alpha in the next week or so. But honestly, I think that it's gonna from a just maturity and trust in the industry. I think that's going to be more of a time-consuming thing.
Agree, fully agree.
Well, we've touched on a lot there, and some super interesting topics. So I thought what would make sense for us is for Linus and David to give us a quick synopsis of their super interesting talks that they did, to be able to, just help everybody summarize the key two big topics that we spoke, or two big announcements, I should say, that we made over the course of the last 3 days. One being AI focused, the other being sort of multi-gateway and multi-broker.
Right.
Yeah.
The big differentiated
Yeah.
multi-gateway
Yes.
and
Yeah.
multi-broker.
Yeah.
So which of you guys wants to go first? I'll let you fight it out.
I will probably win that fight because I mean, just because I'm quicker to take the advantage of the word. So yeah, I think so. Obviously, in my session, I announced two important capabilities, and it builds on that multi-gateway, multi-broker capability. We've spoken about event-driven architecture. We've spoken about event-native. Obviously, Gravitee has over the last year or so supported sitting on top of Kafka, sitting on top of Solus, MQTT, AMQP. And we have these amazing customers that are presenting here at the conference talking about how they build new experiences, new use cases, new products using these capabilities of offer those events in whatever shape or way they may want to do with Gravitee. But what we're doing now with Gravitee 4.2 is announcing this capability of allowing, in the first version, Solus users or organizations that use Solus to just use one click to, from Gravitee, discover what's there, make them into APIs in Gravitee and make products out of that. We could then going to add Confluent and other solutions as well.
Yep.
And the other big thing that I announced in the session is the multi-gateway support, right? So you spoke of multi-broker and multi-gateway.
Yep.
And I think you need to do that because otherwise you're not unifying.
True.
If you want to unify, you need to truly unify across both velocity and runtime, basically. So the first one that we were rolling out support for in 4.2 is Amazon API Gateway. Amazon API Gateway obviously being the most adopted gateway in the market in terms of number of users. We have many customers using that. Now, something like Amazon doesn't necessarily have that full breadth of API management, developer portal, and documentation, that sort of stuff. And I think that's really where something like Gravitee can add value.
I still think it's super interesting, even like those hyperscaler platforms and stuff like that, that in Gravitee, you'll have that ability to be able to come into it and go, hey, let's have one unified place that I can enable people to discover, whether it's a Kinesis topic, whatever it may be, MSK, AWS API Gateway, then sitting alongside, let's say you had an old school legacy gateway like, I don't know, an Apogee or whatever it may be, then that is pretty cool actually, and that you could then unify all of that from a Gravitee perspective and also put the Gravitee Gateway there, that sort of thing. Super interesting. So thanks for sharing that. David, why don't you give us a quick rundown of what you spoke about?
Sure. So from my side, that's basically kind of an extension. Kind of an extension to what you just said, Linus, because obviously at the heart we heard about this unification, as you said, Rory, and the federation thing from you, Linus. And for me, what we are also building around what we call the next generation AI developer experience / portal that's entirely based on what we are discovering, what we are getting from these different providers. So whatever you're federating stuff from, you said the Solace, the AWS API Gateway, the hyperscaler, maybe competitors such as APIG, whatever, we have a unique chance to rely on some standards such as OpenAPI, Async API. We can ingest all the information from these sort of specifications, and so we can give and we can provide even better AI capabilities to the developer to really simplify, to really ease his experience, his journey, to make sure that he's just using what he's looking for. So we are not asking them to look at an API with, I don't know, X hundred of different endpoints. You are asking for something, what's the target is or the backend is, we can bring it to you, we can generate code for you, you can integrate it into your IDE, and the job is done. So you can just imagine about, what sort of business acceleration we can bring at the end.
That is awesome.
Exciting stuff.
I love that. And all of that's coming tomorrow, did you say, David?
Yesterday already. Yeah, I mean, we already did the demo, so it's already done.
Yeah, that's true, actually. That is true. Very good. Well, that's it from us. The three amigos. I can't remember what it is in French. What is it in French? Les trois
amis.
Les trois
amis.
amis.
In Swedish?
In Swedish?
In Swedish.
Tre polarna, maybe?
Okay, I'm not going to try that one.
Très pur là.
Très pur là. Okay. So
that's butchering a whole continent. I was going to say.
that's it from the three amigos, and thank you very much.
Yeah,
Have a
thank you.
wonderful time, and thank you again for participating in these last 3 days. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I've had a lot of fun in this session, actually, speaking to the guys. And thank you to all of our speakers, actually. I do want to just say that. It's a real pleasure from my perspective, and I'm sure Linus and David share that with me as well. The amount of interesting stuff that people have spoken about, the questions that we've seen coming in, the way that everybody's engaged with this, you know, from my perspective, it's a real honor, actually, to be able to sit and to hear from all those sorts of people, and to, you know, to do it in our first conference at Gravitee Edge has been a real privilege, actually. So thank you to all of those people who have participated. Thank you to all of you who've participated online, who've shared, who've liked, who've commented, who've challenged us, all these different sorts of things. Please keep it coming. Please keep it coming. As I said at the beginning, we do have another 30 days that enables you to watch this back if there are things you're particularly interested in. We would love to hear from you. I know Linus, David and I spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about these subjects. We are continuously messaging each other and talking about these subjects, keeping each other up at night, etc., etc. So thank you all for everything, and until next year, goodbye from us.
Bye-bye.
Ciao,
Thank
you
you
very much.